Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 26th of January of 2023. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Russian sources map. As you can see, there are a lot of icons all over the Ukraine. As you know, today the Russians made another massive missiles attack, and as a result of that attack they managed to destroy a lot of warehouses, a lot of artillery, a lot of air defense system, some energy facilities system, and so on. A lot of towns on the territory of Ukraine are without electricity and so on. And I believe that the Russians will increase the pressure during these days because, as we discussed a few days ago, I told you that the temperature is below zero these days, and I believe that this is the last window during this winter campaign for anything. For any offensive operation, if the Russians are planning to start anything. And if you remember, right before the Russians started their offensive operation in Vuhledar, for about 5 or a little more or less days in a row, the Russians were attacking Ukraine with missiles and drones and so on. And after that, they announced about ceasefire period. And right after ceasefire period, the Russians established control over entire Vuhledar and the vicinity of that town. And when talking about today, these days, we know that the Russians made something, let's call it recon combat on Zaporizhzhia area. Yesterday, we received a lot of updates about heavy clashes on Vuhledar, and today we see massive missile attacks. So I believe that these days we are going to see the increasing of pressure. So let's discuss step by step. First of all, let's discuss Kherson district. The Ukrainians activated in this area, and the Ukrainians try to cross the river using the boats and they try to send the commandos group as much as possible in this area, trying to maybe to establish some bridgehead in this area. I believe that the Russians, because of water barrier and because of very big difficulties to cross this river, the Russians took a decision to move a lot of forces from this area. There are some rear guard forces or some patrol, but there are not much forces in this area. And when talking about this area, the main power in this region are drones, Russian spy drones and Russian artillery system. So this is, and maybe helicopters or something like this. These are the forces and the power the Russians use in this area to prevent any Ukrainian attempt to cross this river. But during the previous week, the Ukrainians made at least 3 or 4 attempts to cross the river. All those attempts were collapsed. The Ukrainians were defeated. They were just losing soldiers. But I believe that the main goal that the Ukrainians want to achieve by this crossing is that they're just doing trainings. They try to create some experience base before upcoming spring and summer offensive operation, and I believe that the Ukrainians will try to cross the river meanwhile they're attacking from the north in Zaporizhzhia area. So now they won't just need some experience. They need some experience. They need some soldiers who are able to follow and to push the Ukrainian army during the spring and summer. If we are when talking about Ukrainian losses during the previous 48 or 24 hours of artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost 3 howitzers D-20. They lost another howitzer Gvozdika, and also the Ukrainians lost 2 raiders in this area, INTPQ-37 and INTPQ-50 in this area. As you can see, the Ukrainians, they moved a lot of artillery systems to support all these crossing operations. So the Russians, I believe, will be forced to move some artillery back on this front line as well. Furthermore, the Russians report that they destroyed at least few warehouses in this area. To be more precise, 4 warehouses in this area were destroyed as a result of artillery attacks. And as you can see, when talking about today, Odessa and Nikolaev are under very heavy fire by Russian drones and Russian missiles. The Russians were attacking the energy facilities, some industrial zones, and so on, trying to reduce as much as possible the Ukrainian power in this area. Now let's move to Zaporizhzhia area. As you can see, there are not much icons. Most of the icons are located on Zaporizhzhia, around in the vicinity of Zaporizhzhia itself. The Russians attack energy facilities in this area. The Russians were attacking oil depot in this area, and they destroyed this depot, and there were a number of other attacks, and for now there are no information what exactly did the Russians got during the day. When talking about the situation on the front line, on the combat line, there are not much changes. Also, the Russians continue their offense, their let's say offensive operation, but mainly there were artillery duels. The Russians tried to develop some movements in direction of Orekhov, but not for a very big distance, just a small meters, I believe, or kilometers. I'm not even sure if they were able to achieve some success. So when talking about Gulay Polya, the Russians, according to the report of Ministry of Defense, they destroyed another ammo depot in the vicinity of Gulay Polya. No updates about towns, no updates about movements, no updates. There are no updates about Sherbaki, Mali Sherbaki, and so on. When talking about the Ukrainians, I believe I told you that yesterday, the day before yesterday, we got update that Ukrainians managed to accumulate around 40,000 soldiers in this area. Most of the Western countries' military authorities reported that they are planning to provide Ukrainians or to supply Ukrainians with tanks by March. So just 1 month, we can say, left before we see the Western tanks on this front line, and somewhere in the beginning of April or the end of April, the Ukrainians will make another attempt of counteroffensive operation in direction of Melitopol. At least the Ukrainians are saying like that. Now we are moving to South Donetsk area, or to the eastern part of Zaporizhzhia front line, and let's discuss Vuhledar in more details. If you remember, yesterday the Russians started they continued their offensive operation. The day before yesterday, the Russians managed to cross this river Kashlygach. They established control over the residential area that located between Pavlovka and Nikolskoye. And when talking about Pavlovka itself, the Russians managed to cross the river and to establish control over industrial zone that located in the north of Pavlovka. That was the day before yesterday. And when talking about yesterday, the Russians continued their offensive operation. They managed to cross these fields and enter the residential area that located on the south part of Vuhledar, on the south. This is the road, and on the south side of this road, and furthermore, later during the evening and night, we received an update that the Russians managed to enter Vuhledar at least from two sides, from south one, from this area, and from the east part. Let's return back to the Western sources map, and let's try to update the map around Vuhledar according to information we have. So the Russians are saying that they entered Vuhledar from the south, so they control this block. And also the Russians entered Vuhledar from the east. So we can say that this is the area that is under Russian control. There is a very important difference between Vuhledar and towns in Zaporizhzhia. If you remember, right before the offensive operation in Vuhledar, the Russians announced about the same very greatest offensive operation in Zaporizhzhia, that as a result of that attack they managed to establish control over a big number of towns, but later we understood that that was some kind of speculation and so on. And when talking about a situation on the ground, the Russians took just one town, a very small village near Kupiansk. And the most important thing about the offensive operation in Zaporizhzhia is that the Russians during that offensive operation didn't provide any video evidence provements or photo provements and so on. But when talking about Vuhledar today, during the day, the Russians published a lot of video and photos of Vuhledar. There are a lot of fire in Vuhledar. Vuhledar is under 24 hours complete artillery control, fire control. There are very heavy clashes there. And when talking about Vuhledar, as you can see, during the day we haven't received any updates. The Ukrainians managed to complete their regrouping, and when talking about Vuhledar from the Ukrainian side, there is 72nd Mechanized Brigade fighting on the side of Ukrainians, and with this one 72nd Mechanized and 79th Air Assault Brigade. These two brigades is the main power that Ukrainians uses to fight with the Russians. When talking about the Russians, there are at least two brigades in this area. 155th Marine Brigade, they're storming this town, and also I believe the 11th Regiment or something like this. And the Russians, as you might see from this map, they got control over the south, over the hospital area, and over the east side. But as you can see, according to this map, they control this part and they control this part. So as you can see, the Russians, this information we received yesterday in the evening. During the day there were no updates, so by the yesterday evening the Russian controlled just the residential area with the small buildings. As you can see, the south one, there's just one building, this hospital, not very big building, and the east side part as well. By, let's say, by this morning, the Russians haven't entered this residential area with buildings. So this is very powerful fortification. When talking about some benefits or the positive sides, is that the Russians, as we discussed, cut the road that connects Vuhledar and Konstantinovka, and also the Russian cut another road in this area. I believe the Russians established fire control over the west part of Vuhledar, and the Russians established control over, let's say, the east and northeast part. So I believe that there are still one road, this one that Ukrainians are able to use to supply Vuhledar. I'm not sure about armored vehicles, tanks, whether they're able to make some rotation process or so on. But when talking about infantry, I believe that the Ukrainians are able to use this road for some kind of rotation, exchanging process, and so on. This road is under fire, but as you can see, there is a brushes in this area, so I believe that all this line is completely one big trench that Ukrainians can use to protect their manpower from the artillery strikes. So for now, the situation is critical for the Ukrainians. The situation is critical for the Russians as well. It's already the third day in a row they're trying to do something with Vuhledar, and for now they still haven't established control. I believe that they will be able to do this by tomorrow evening, but there is a chance that the Russians will be forced to step back if they can't develop this offensive operation. Or what is the thing that is much worse is that the Russians and Ukrainians will split Vuhledar, let's say, in two parts. It will cause a lot of problems for the Russians, for the Ukrainians as well. But from the Ukrainian side, in this situation, they are not losing Vuhledar. And when talking about the Russians, they can't establish the real control, and they will be forced to keep some forces in this area to continue these clashes on the streets. The losses will be very high. And when talking about Vuhledar, it's 155th Brigade, it's a Russian Mill Army, and of course, to have losses among regular army, it's not very good for the Russians. They need to finish this operation as fast as possible. But for now, there are no progress, just the situation that heavy clashes inside the town. But this town is already on fire. And I believe and I expect that maybe tomorrow by the evening we're going to receive, let's call it the first confirmation that the Russians established control. The Russians will be able to complete the clearing of this town, I believe that not earlier than Monday, upcoming Monday. When talking about Donetsk area, the Russians reported that as a result of heavy clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost around 60 soldiers and something around 5 armored vehicles. Now let's move further to the north and let's discuss Donetsk area. As you can see, there are no updates around Donetsk. There are still heavy clashes in Mariinka. The Russians continue their clearing operation on the north part of Vodyane. They're trying to push in Peromaisk, but also we haven't received any updates from this area. Then the most important towns, as we discussed, is Nivoyska and the complete operation in Peromaisk, but no updates about this. When talking about Bakhmut, the Wagners are continuous storming. Today the Russian source map has been updated, and as you can see, the Russians added another trenches that completely newly built from scratch trenches. The Ukrainians complete these trenches just a few days ago, and they started building of these trenches during the evacuation process from Solidar. They have completed this operation, and now the Russians these days are trying to storm these trenches because they need them to continue their offensive operation in the direction of Blagodatne. When talking about Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost during the previous 24 hours around 40 soldiers, 1 armored vehicles, and around 6 artillery systems. The Ukraine lost 2 Grad systems, 1 Paladin howitzer, another D-20 howitzer, and 1 Getsin B howitzer. The Russian sources are showing some icon of promotion of development of bridgehead on the west from Klishchevka. They're moving in direction of these brushes, trying to cut the road between Chasov Yar and Ivanovska, but no video confirmation, no movements, like nothing from Bakhmut for now. Just clashes inside the town, around the town, in direction of Krasnogora, Paraskovyevka, and as you can see, without any progress for anybody. When talking about Seversk front line, the situation is stable, no movements, just regular artillery duels. There are a lot of Ukrainians still in the forest, and but there are a lot of updates interesting from Lyman front line. The Russians during the previous 24 hours were attacking the Ukrainians 25th Brigade, 95th Brigade in this forest, and in Yampolovka, in Yampolovka, and on this line. And the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours were trying to make very big offensive operation in this area using at least few BTGs, and they started their movements in direction of Dnipro, in direction of this territory. And but they were spotted by the Russians. All these offensive operations were under cover of Ukrainian M777 artillery systems, but the Russians spotted everything. They discovered every single step, and they first they destroyed at least 4 M777 artillery systems, and after that they managed to reduce the Ukrainians as much as possible, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back on this front line. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians are saying they managed to destroy around 70 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and as I told you, around 4 M777 artillery systems. When talking about Kupiansk front line, the Russians were attacking mainly the 14th Mechanized Brigade, 92nd Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of towns like Sinkovka, Timkovka, Novosilovskaya, so mainly around this bridgehead. But as a result of those clashes, the Ukrainians lost just 20 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and just 1 artillery system, D-20 howitzer. So as you can see, the most important updates I would like to tell you about Zaporizhzhia area. There was a lot of, as I told you, video and photo confirmation, and the thing is why the Russians took a decision to start offensive operation in Vuhledar is that it's the period of time, January, in the south of Ukraine, in this area, when there are a lot of fog and you can't see anything in more than in 10 meters. So everything is like big blue cloud on the ground. So this is the reason why the Russians were able to cross these fields and to get so close to Vuhledar, just because of fog, because of weather. And if you follow the situation in Ukraine since 2014, you will know that there were the same story with the Donetsk airport and with Debaltseve. The Russians established control over airport almost at the same period of time during January, and the main reason why they did this, why could they do this, is just there was a fog, and they managed to cross fields, and the Ukrainians just couldn't see them. So that's why the Ukrainians were not able to use artillery support and artillery supreme in this area and to suppress the Russian offensive operation. And when talking about Vuhledar, we can see the same story. I'm not sure how long this weather are going to be on this territory of Ukraine, but anyway, these three days were enough to cross the fields and to get inside of Vuhledar, and this is exactly what the Russians needs. And now they will complete the mission to establish control over Vuhledar. The question is what price they're going to pay for this. For now, weather allows them to do this, allow them to move through the fields, allow them to send more armored vehicles. If the fog is going to disappear the next days, the Russians need to or establish control or suppress the first line of defense on Vuhledar, and just to make Ukrainians blind from these windows and not to allow them to see the movements on the field. If the Russians are able to do this, they will be able to move, to make rotation process, move infantry, move tanks as much as they need without any problem and without any scare to be spotted by the Ukrainians and so on. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.